is greed the reason we're in Omicron's cross? I've heard it pronounced both ways. Typically Omicron. In Omicron's crosshairs. I mean, there was a time in America where we didn't think greed was a good thing, right? We recognized that it was one of the 7 deadly sins. In fact, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, it was the worst of the 7 deadly sins, according to Jesus. But here we have this new variant that apparently emerged in South Africa, which has for 14 months now been begging for a waiver, a patent waiver. They call them TRIPS waivers. You know, you've heard Lori Wallach on this program over the last year. You know, we've talked about this probably a dozen times on this show with her as a guest. The proposal is to say, okay, you know, countries that don't have a lot of money, can't afford to buy these vaccines, at the really high prices, should be able to manufacture, but do have advanced manufacturing capability, should be able to manufacture them themselves and pay a small fee, a small royalty to the companies that invented them, but not the full freight, right? And not have to buy them from those companies. And, you know, there's precedent for this. We've done this with other things and, over the years. And it's it's an appeal to the World Trade Organization to basically suspend patent protections. And of course, the companies, I mean, Pfizer's going to make billions on this. Moderna making billions on this. Johnson & Johnson, while they're making billions on this, they're also declaring bankruptcy to avoid paying liability for people who got mesothelioma and lung cancer from their baby powder. So why is all this happening? Why is it that this variant is emerging in South Africa where, you know, the vaccination rate is so very, very low? Because of greed. Greed is the bottom line here. You know, for 10, 15 years, we've had a caller, Gary, you know, who constantly, it used to be whenever he called in, the first thing he'd say is, greed has no heart, Tom. And he's right. The single most brilliant and the single most evil thing that Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman did in the last century was convincing Americans that greed was no longer one of the 7 deadly sins, but instead was some sort of an essential good that should be rewarded and celebrated. And as a direct consequence of this 40-year experiment, this greed is good experiment, you can call it neoliberalism, you can call it Reaganism, it is both. America now has the highest COVID death rate in the developed world. Our democracy is in tatters. And you got armed white power militias proudly terrorizing Christmas shoppers. I don't know if you caught this on Long Island, you know, literally out terrorizing people who are going Christmas shopping. Yeah, right. That's so sweet, right? The United Nations has documented the fact that the United States has the most billionaires in the world. We also have the worst poverty in the developed world and the worst homelessness crisis in the developed world. Why? Because for 40 years, this Reagan idea that greed is good has been literally killing America and Americans. And I'm making the argument that we need to return to, quote, traditional values in America. What are those traditional values? I'm not talking in code here like Jerry Falwell, where traditional values meant segregation and hating on people who aren't straight white men. No, I'm talking about trashing greed. Let's just start rejecting greed. This was a traditional value in many regards in this country. It certainly has been in religion. I mean, for 2,000 years, Christianity has preached it, Judaism for longer than that. Jesus in Luke 12:15, he says, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Before Reagan, we had a 91% top income tax bracket that was designed to protect us from the behavior of the greediest among us. And it did. It grew this huge middle class between the 1930s and the 1980s. The largest and most powerful and successful middle class in the history of the world, which is now gutted. 65% of us were in the middle class when Reagan came into office. It's now 45%. It's why we enforce laws against monopoly in the United States, was to restrain greedy behavior in corporate boardrooms and among CEOs. It's why we prided ourselves as having this huge middle class. We also realize that when people are overtaken by greed, they are suffering from mental illness. We used to know this. Remember the story of Howard Hughes walking around, with his hundreds of millions of dollars in his hotel room in Las Vegas with his feet in Kleenex boxes and long hair and long fingernails and all this kind of stuff? Or the Hunt brothers who were, funding the John Birch Society and everything way back in the day, the guys who tried to corner the silver market. One of them, H.L. Hunt, was the richest man in the world at the time. And they were psychologically in hell, these people. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, calls greed one of only two capital sins. A capital sin is like the worst sin there is because all the other sins come out of it. And he identified pride and greed as the only two capital sins. He said it would seem that no other special sins besides pride and greed should be called capital, one from which other sins arise. Paul, as an old man, wrote a letter to Timothy, who was one of his young disciples, and he said, "They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil." In the 5th century, St. Augustine wrote in his book, City of God, quote, "Greed is not a defect in the gold that is desired, but in the man who loves it perversely." But Reagan and Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and these other libertarian luminaries, the Rand Pauls of their day, believed that because greed is such an electrifying and powerful driver of behavior, that instead of trying to control it or suppress it, we should embrace it, that it would be a social good. It should be celebrated. It should be amplified. But that was a lie. Greed doesn't feed a baby when she cries. Greed doesn't protect homes from fire and crime. Greed doesn't house the homeless or heal the ill. Greed didn't care for the injured Samaritan, the foreigner by the roadside. Greed does not bring people together. It tears societies apart. And that's why it's been roundly condemned from Aristotle, who said, quote, "Greed has no boundaries," to today. 40 years of Reagan's neoliberal experiment has proven that unrestrained greed brings us massive tax cuts for the morbidly rich, creates widespread homelessness, sends our jobs overseas, repeatedly crashes our economy, so we have to bail out the billionaires who caused the problem. We don't have to, but we choose to because why? Because we've got politicians who are on the take too, exploits workers, and today is poisoning our atmosphere and our oceans with carbon dioxide and other pollutants that could ultimately end human civilization, maybe even human life on Earth. But the neoliberals say, but greed drives the economy. No, this is, Gordon Gekko, right? Michael Douglas, greed is a good. No, it's a lie. People who go to work every day don't do so because they're greedy. They do so to care for their families and hopefully because they find some meaning in their work. I certainly do. Most entrepreneurs don't start businesses because they're greedy. They're trying to build a business that can contribute to society while providing for their families. Plus, it's fun. We don't buy things because we're greedy. We purchase things to meet needs or increase comfort for ourselves and our kids. Before the Republican Party embraced greed as a prime virtue in the 1980s, we had a long list of our most beloved politicians, people who clearly lost money going into public service. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln lost his life, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Jack and Robert Kennedy, Jimmy Carter. All of these people left office poorer than they entered it. Today, our politics have been almost entirely corrupted by greed since 5 greed-loving so-called conservatives on the Supreme Court in Citizens United said, it's okay, it's a good thing for politicians to be owned by big business and billionaires. And therefore, now it's almost impossible because there's, the entire Republican Party is bought in on this. It was their idea to begin with, Reagan's. And you've got a handful of Democrats, people like Kurt Schrader here in Oregon, who are just, big pharma wants to give me money? Cool. And so good politicians can't even take on big pharma or big oil or big banks or big tech or big billionaires. Greed is the essential poison that we've been warned about for years. We used to embrace stories that resisted greed. A Christmas Carol by Dickens. You know, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. The story of the Grinch. We loved the idea of people redeeming themselves from greed. These are the values that we have to return to as a country. And if we fail to, if we continue to embrace this Reaganista idea that greed is the best thing there is, our country's going to be destroyed.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
By the way, you look up greed in the dictionary, what do you see? A picture of Donald Trump. What say you? How do we do this?